Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another entry in our webinar series for journalists, broadcast to you live from YouTube. Just like all our other previous webinars, you're going to be able to watch this one on the channel a day or two after we finish. So please do make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel for further updates about that. So today's webinar is going to explore how to cover extractive industry impacts on Indigenous peoples and local communities, whom you may hear abbreviated during this webinar as IPLCs. This is a very expansive topic, and you'll hear us discuss issues related to many different types of extractive industries. Issues related to IPLCs and land rights are very complex and nuanced, and while we won't cover everything there is to know, we do hope that today's discussion provides a good springboard from which you can inform your reporting. So if after viewing today's webinar, you have a story idea you would like to pitch to us, as always, we heartily encourage you to do so by visiting mongabay.org. Head down to our opportunities page and link from there, scroll down the page and click on Indigenous Peoples, Local Communities, and Conservation, or Land Rights and Extractive Industries. We do encourage you to pitch your story ideas to Mongabay or to other outlets that cover these topics, such as GRIST or the Mining Observatory or others. And while on the opportunities page, you can also sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which shares new paid reporting opportunities and job openings at Mongabay. So today we're going to use our usual webinar format where our panelists will answer 10 central questions. And then at the conclusion of the hour, we're going to open up the floor to your questions. But first, I want to go ahead and introduce our panel, starting with Tristan Atone. Tristan is a member of the Kiowa tribe and is editor-at-large at GRIST. He previously served as editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at High Country News. He has reported for Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour, Native News, NPR, and National Geographic. His stories have won multiple honors, including investigative awards from the Gannett Foundation and Public Radio News Directors Incorporated. A former president of the Native American Journalists Association, Tristan is a 2017 Neiman Fellow and director of the Muckrock Foundation. Tristan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And next is Victoria Tauli Corpuz. Victoria is the executive director of the Tebteba Foundation and is an indigenous leader from the Kankana'i Igorot people of the Cordillera region in the Philippines. She formerly served as the United Nations Special Reporter on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the Human Rights Council from 2014 until April 2020. And she has worked as an indigenous activist and advocate for women's rights for over 3 decades. Victoria, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. Thank you.
It's okay. And next we have Maurizio Angelo. Maurizio is an award-winning international freelance investigative journalist and founder of the Mining Observatory, a Brazil-based investigative journalism center established in 2015. He publishes in many media outlets in Brazil and worldwide and was the winner of the Excellence in Journalism Award 2019 by the Inter-American Press Association. And he was also considered one of Brazil's top 3 journalist experts in the extractive sector in 2021. So Maurizio, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
And I am your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo, Audience Engagement Associate for Mongabay. So just a reminder to everyone watching, I'm going to give each panelist a chance to answer 10 different questions that we'll be covering today, and then we'll be holding an audience Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, I recommend you save it for that time. Don't forget that you're also going to be able to view this entire webinar on demand on our YouTube channel a day or two after the broadcast is finished, which will be complete with timestamps and resources that will be included. So now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and get started with our first question. So there are a lot of different kinds of extractive industries, and their impacts will vary depending on the type and the community they affect. So what is the best way for journalists to differentiate between extractive industries for a general audience and the impacts they have upon IPLCs? Anyone can answer. Victoria, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I think that the difference between indigenous peoples, the impact of extractive industries on indigenous peoples and the general public, is that indigenous peoples have collective rights on their lands, territories, and resources, and they are also in many cases they are collectively holding these lands, no, so the impact will not only affect the individual but the community in general, and it doesn't just affect them, environmentally, but also culturally and spiritually. So I think that's one of the big differences.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would add that in terms of when I'm thinking about this as an audience question, I generally think of my audience as Indigenous readers or viewers. So to some degree, I don't really differentiate between the two in terms of who I'm reporting for. I think it's really important that we're providing as clear information as possible to Indigenous readers and audiences, and typically, I think that translates pretty well to general audiences.
Great, thank you, Tristan. Mauricio, do you have anything to add? All right, we're going to move on to, sorry, did someone else have anything to add?
You can move forward.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question here. So are there any important angles or topics that are often overlooked that journalists should pay attention to when covering extractive projects and their related impacts?
Yeah,
I
mean, oh no, please.
Okay. Well, right now I'm more interested in to know in stories about who is funding the extractive projects, who is behind the scenes, who is the financiers who pay for the expansion of mining industry, especially in the case of Brazil in the Amazon, for example, including of course inside indigenous land. So I quote here a report where I published this year with Amazon Watch, exactly showing some of the big financial institutions behind this interest in indigenous land in the Amazon, including some big American companies like Capital Group, BlackRock and Vanguard. So I think this kind of stories to trace the supply chain, who is financing this project. It's very important and it's overlooked so far.
Great, thank you, Mauricio. Anyone else have anything to say?
The things that are not also made more visible is that the points that was raised by Mauricio indeed is important. So knowing who are the ones responsible for these extractive industries, and also knowing the methods they use, to be able to either get contracts or enter into indigenous territories. And of course, one of the things that's not talked very often is the use of mining companies, for instance, of mercenaries, as their security forces. And so the kinds of human rights violations that happen are really in you can see it in the worst possible ways. So maybe the methods that they are using to intimidate or to harass or to force indigenous peoples to open up to their operations. And of course the other thing is there is this thing called the extractive industries transparency initiative, and it talks about the benefits, of indigenous peoples, if there is at all. But it doesn't really, you don't really see whether indigenous peoples have received this, because such kinds of even royalties goes through government agencies. So really the stories about what kinds of benefits, if there are, do be indigenous peoples get from these extractive industries.
Great, thank you, Victoria.
I'd also add, just looking at rights-based solutions is really a big part of the puzzle. I mean, I think here, at least in the United States, there tends to be a framing around Indigenous stories about, promises that were broken to, tribal nations, and it's not an accurate framing. We're talking about, the law or breaking the law in order to, in many times, to create these projects, and they're both state guidelines and international, legal covenants that really regulate a lot of this and provide solutions. And I think, when we keep seeing this sort of push for solutions journalism, one of the areas that I don't think we're seeing enough of is actually looking at those different legal instruments and international agreements that really can push some new thinking around how to deal with some of these projects.
Thank you so much, Tristan. So I believe everyone's answered that one. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. So some laws or legal frameworks specifically protect Indigenous people. However, a few companies have argued that a community is in fact not Indigenous, as is the case with the Salala Rubber Corporation's plantation in Liberia. So what guidelines should journalists use when defining who is an Indigenous person and who is not?
One of the key principles that's used in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is self-identification. No, there are people who the government may not recognize as indigenous, no, but they proclaim themselves and they proclaim their identities as indigenous peoples. So that's one principle, and of course the other way to deal with is that's why we also include local communities, sometimes indigenous peoples and local communities, because even if you are not an indigenous peoples, for instance, you still have the right, no, to have a say over what kind of development or project is brought to your community. So that doesn't preclude you to use the international instruments that are applicable, in cases whether indigenous or not. We have the guiding principles on business and human rights, which asks for due diligence and access to justice. No, and these are some of the instruments that they can make use of uh, to assert their claims, and journalists should be, as mentioned earlier, should be made aware about these kinds of instruments or mechanisms.
Thank you, Victoria. Did anyone have anything to add?
Well, I just like to add, like here in Brazil, for example, we have a lot of indigenous who live in urban areas, not in the Amazon or in the forest, and the government very often doesn't recognize these people as indigenous, including for some health policies, public policies in general. So, like Victoria says, the self-identification, the indigenous organizations are very important to the journalists to listen to, and not always follow what the government say here and that.
Thank you, Maurizio.
Yeah, I would just add, I think this really speaks to needing, Indigenous reporters from those communities that you're reporting on to do that work. Obviously, because it is complex. Self-identification is obviously a guideline that can be followed, but it's also a mechanism that we've seen, at least here in the U.S., be used in nefarious ways by individuals to say, well, I identify as this particular tribe, even though the tribe or community in particular feels very differently about that. So I think it speaks to that it's different everywhere, but this really comes down to who you're working with as a news organization, and that you're bringing in people that have that deep expertise, or Indigenous reporters who can handle that kind of information. But usually parachuting in to sort of deal with this and try to figure this out on the fly is typically not a good idea.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question here. So as we all know, obviously indigenous communities are not a monolith and are very diverse in their interests, goals, and cultures, both between and within communities. And for example, certain communities have practiced artisanal mining for centuries, and others are completely against it. And some members would like to participate in large-scale activities. This could be for additional income, the slow disintegration of traditional ecological values, and transition to the globalized economy, local control of natural resources, or opportunistic climate adaptation, as seen in Greenland, with indigenous support for sand extraction on the melting ice sheet. So what is the best way for journalists to talk about the nuances and the complexities of indigenous support or opposition to extractive projects when communicating them to a broader audience? I know that's a big question, but yeah.
Well, I mean, just starting. I mean, I think a lot of it is again, working with indigenous reporters as much as possible because these are complex. This idea that you can sort of like parachute in and figure this out is really quite, I think, dangerous to the kind of reporting that can be done and the kind of information that gets out to audiences and readers. Obviously there are different viewpoints on almost everything in indigenous communities, but I also think this is partly um, something that an outlet needs to be thinking about in terms of what they're hoping to get across in terms of their reporting. A lot of reporters like to show up and just look for conflict, like, oh, there are different opposing viewpoints in this indigenous community about this mine, and frankly, I'm not really sure what the point of those stories are most of the time, except to find conflict and maybe find sort of an exotic story to report. So I think on the part of the reporter and the news outlet, you really have to think about why you're going in there, why you're doing this story, what the value of the story is. And I think even, again, to the first question that you posed earlier about audience, if your audience is an indigenous audience, is that actually a story, or are you, just sort of jumping into something that people are already familiar with and know very well? So that also speaks to audience too. So there's some factors I think to think about when venturing into that area.
Great. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Justin.
Yeah, and I think that we also have to be very aware that there are very conscious forces that really divide the people within the indigenous communities. No, these are either the mining corporations themselves or the government itself. No, because they are also collaborating closely with the mining corporations, no, and so that factor also has to be looked into. And as Tristan has said, I think that it really, what's the purpose of you making the story if the purpose is to really show what the impacts are in terms of environmental devastation, health results, among others. Those should be the focus, because that's what we are looking for every time. Is this kind of industry helping indigenous peoples, or it is uh, further undermining their rights and destroying the societies that they would like to build on live for their future generations?
Thank you, Victoria.
Yeah, I just like to add, like in Brazil, for example, Brazil is home to about 1 million indigenous people who speak more than 274 languages. So we have, of course, each community has their own history, their own opinion, and their own process of consultation, and they should be respected for their opinion about some extractive project or not. Just to the broader audience to know, in Brazil, mining in indigenous land is not allowed. It's forbidden by law. So we don't have industrial mining in indigenous land, but we have a lot of garimpo, wildcat mining, illegal mining, especially all over the Amazon, with with thousands of garimpeiros, workers, inside this indigenous land. So we have a serious problem with garimpo here, but industrial mining is not allowed. We have some bills and law projects in the Congress right now who are trying to change this, to change the constitution and approve industrial mining and agribusiness and other activities inside indigenous land.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have anything to add before we move on to the next question? Okay. Along with this complexity, obviously, one indigenous source doesn't represent the views of the entire community on a particular extractive project. So, which voices within a community should also be sought out and uplifted in an article? Are there particular perspectives or rankings within a council that journalists should pay close attention to?
Think that of course especially if this is a community that has its own autonomous governance systems, then of course the ones who are in charge of self-governing their communities should really be asked. But I would like to stress that women, indigenous women, for instance, their views are very important. Sometimes their views differ from men, and these kinds of views should also be highlighted as well. Of course, the young people, some young people, they think more in terms of maybe some young people are more inclined to believe in the kind of economy being brought into their communities. So it's also important to talk to them. But so I think it's true that there is not a single voice, but as much as possible to reach out to those who are directly impacted by these operations, and listen and make more visible the reasons why they are either for it or against it, and the kinds of support that they are asking for them to be able to assert the right to self-determination.
Thank you, Vicky.
Yeah, I would second that in terms of looking for impacted parties and leadership. But again, this requires a lot of understanding of the community that you're going into. Like, how are they governed? Who are the community leaders that you should be talking to? The complexities that you sort of hinted at here, can be very, very wide, and take a long time to navigate. But I mean, I think generally, especially if you're a non-Indigenous reporter and you're out, trying to do this work, treating the community that you're going to like you would any other community. Like if you were going to go and do a story about like a mine in Nebraska, how would you go about like handling that story? I think the same sort of guiding principles that you would use in a small town, for instance, in sort of middle of the U.S., to some degree applies to indigenous communities. And obviously, that's not a one-to-one comparison. But if you're wanting to be able to do good work around these topics and in these different communities that are dealing with these issues, I think you have to be prepared to come with the utmost respect and understanding of those leadership structures and how different and complex they can be.
I'd just like to add, like Victoria said, for example, some issues affected more women and children, like the contamination of rivers with heavy metals, which is very common here in Brazil. So, who makes children born with health problems. So, of course, it's important to hear what women has to say about, and it's also important to understand the family dynamic of each community, who are the leaders, the council members, and etc., and understand where you're going to and why you're going to.
Thank you, Maurizio. Does anyone have anything to add before we move on? Okay. So this is kind of calling back a little bit to something we talked about earlier. So when national laws don't protect Indigenous peoples and local communities' land rights, access to resources, or free, prior, and informed consent, how should journalists invoke legal mechanisms in the text, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, otherwise known as UNDRIP, or international court rulings? So how should journalists invoke these legal mechanisms to speak about rights and protections, and which ones do they use?
journalists generally, of course, refer to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is slowly becoming a customary law, no, in a sense, because it has, of course, been adopted by more than 140 countries, and there are national laws that translates it at the national level. So it is it is an instrument that will be used whether the government recognizes indigenous people's rights or not. No, and that's why we use this instrument. The other thing, of course, as you mentioned, are the precedents. No, the precedents that have been used in various countries. No, lawyers would always look for how was this similar situation addressed, for instance, by the Supreme Courts in other countries. So I think that's another important thing to bear in mind every time we talk about the issue of extractive industries and indigenous peoples. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, there are these guiding principles. You know, the voluntary guiding principles on business and human rights, which can be invoked as well, and of course other mechanisms like the extractive industry transparency initiative. No, they have also some principles, and even the global compact, they do have principles that recognize free prior informed consent of indigenous peoples, and most governments have signed on to this or have adopted these kinds of instruments. So I think those are some of the things that should be used by journalists.
Thank you, Victoria.
I mean, even in countries that do have laws protecting,
Yeah.
indigenous rights and communities, you still have to sort of explain these. And I think,
Yeah.
again, part of that is sort of what are the goals of your outlet and the story that you're working on. But even, most of my work focuses here in the United States, and the fact that we still have to sort of explain that, treaties are they're not promises, they are the law, and they are, constitutionally backed, is, well, I guess it's not surprising that we have to keep doing this, but even when there is this background, like, people usually don't know it, and there's usually a reason for that. It's not in the state's interest to sort of educate the general public that, like, indigenous people have rights and have legal recourse for things that happen to them. So, I think really in terms of like what we're talking about when we're reporting stories that require this kind of context, is that you just need the context regardless, and the fact that there are different levels that you can sort of add to those stories, I think is really important, but also requires quite a bit of like thoughtfulness, because 1,000 words just to explain how the legal system works is a lot. You're writing a legal paper sometimes, so that the trick is in your exposition and how you write it up, and sort of your knowledge around these different mechanisms and laws. So maybe in short, you need to know it really well if you're going to write about it.
Thank you very much, Tristan.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you always should invoke all the laws and mechanisms and the constitution, for example, here in Brazil, but that depends on which country you live on. In Brazil, in the past 4 years, we don't have a very strong democracy. The Bolsonaro government basically disrespects all indigenous rights. So it's important to explain the context, the legal context, because it's not a favor the government are doing for indigenous. It's the constitution, is the law, who are not being followed by the government in first place. So it's important to the audience to know what kind of violations we are talking about.
Yeah, and may I add something more? I just the other thing, that the other reality that indigenous peoples face is that even if there's a law, no, in many cases these laws are not even implemented. I am from the Philippines. We have a very strong Indigenous Peoples Rights Act that is now in its 25th year of existence, but still, when the mining companies come, they still do a lot mechanisms, measures to go around the law. We have a Philippine Mining Act of 1995, which also reiterates free, prior, informed consent from indigenous people should be obtained. But again, I mean, this is something that they try to manipulate. They divide the communities. They would get the government to only get those who are consenting to the project to be the ones who will talk on behalf of the community. So there are various ways in which they try to go around the law. So having a law is one thing, but making sure that this looking at how these laws are implemented is another. And because that in at least as a rapporteur, I have seen in many countries how such laws are really are not used in the ways that we would like them to be used.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything else to add? All right. So with that said, in 2019, Mongabay reported on a story in Ecuador where the Waorani indigenous community sued the state for conducting a flawed consultation process that put their territory up for an international oil auction. The consultation involved misinformation and a lack of translation from Spanish into their indigenous language. So in a recent interview with the community's lawyer, Maria Espinoza, she talks about some loopholes and evasions that companies use to perform extraction projects on IPLC lands. So what are some of the most common loopholes and faults journalists may encounter when extractive projects or mining concessions are proposed on disputed lands? Anyone?
Victoria, I feel like you know this much better.
I'm not a journalist, so I would like to give you the first word. I'm just so, but anyhow, yeah, I think that really the way that these loopholes are used, or are, even as I said, even if it's very defined strongly in the law, it's not, they just don't look for the loopholes. They use other means to get the consent, for instance. And sometimes in at, for various governments, of course, they always invoke the right of the state to bring about economic growth. no so no matter, even if there are such laws, like during this COVID process, the COVID pandemic, many governments have said that we have to close our eyes to the laws because we have to grow. We are in a very bad shape, so they justify the way that they open these mines even without any consent because of other circumstances. So I think they both they try to look at the loopholes. They use like so-called more powerful laws, the economic laws or the bilateral treaties that they entered into with investors. They would say that we will be sued by these investors because we have a bilateral agreement with them, a treaty with them. So those are the kinds of those are the ways in which they try to get around all these laws that are in place. And in many cases, they don't even bother to use loopholes in the law.
Yeah, I mean, I would just bureaucracy is always a really great tool to sort of get loopholes around. I mean, we look at the at Standing Rock, for instance. I mean, that situation culminated after what, 3 years of the federal government more or less taking advantage of different loopholes within the legal system to circumvent any sort of free, prior, or informed consent, or having any sort of consultation process with the Standing Rock Sioux. So I mean, in terms of good loopholes and places to look is just looking at how your government is dealing with communities, and what are some of the ways in which they should be doing that. And Yeah, those are some great ways to sort of start and understanding how the system works. I mean, if you understand how the system works, then you will know how you can game the system, right? And this is, I think, one of the job as journalists is to figure out like how can you take advantage of the system? Because if you know how you could do that, you can report on the people who do that.
Thank you, Tristan.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the situation varies a lot depending on each country. But last year, I made a series of stories about how mining works in indigenous land, of course, in United States, Canada, Australia, and Chile, besides Brazil. And so I study the body of laws in these each countries, and I talk with several indigenous leaders from these countries, and basically they say to me, well, they're still, for example, they're still invoking the doctrine of discovery until now to all over disputed lands. All kinds of deals and treaties are basically not respect. And of course, one indigenous community don't have the money that one big mining industry have to pay the lawyers and etc. So it's really, really unbalanced, uh, disputed over land, and basically we have some incredible situations which the indigenous rights are not respected, and the journalists should look at every detail of in each case to tell a proper story for the audience.
Thank you, Mauricio. Does anyone have anything to add before I move on to the next question?
That the other thing that I have seen is that, for instance, in Canada, they will say, "Oh, we have these strict laws that will that we use when mining issues come in." But Canada, as we all know, is operating all over the world, and so they are incoherent because they have double standards. They will say they have these strict laws in Canada, but when they come to the Philippines, they don't use their own standard to define their behavior as far as the Philippines is concerned. So I think that kind of double standard also has to be exposed. And of course, what people in what many people don't know is, for instance, in Canada, they said there's an ombudsman that you can go and report, if ever there are mining companies abroad Canadian mining companies who are violating human rights. But that is not known very well, no. So it will be good if a journalist also will sort of inform people about what are these existing systems or mechanisms in those countries where the mining companies are based, so that at least those who have been suffering from the mining operations can also make use of this.
Thank you, Victoria.
I would just like to add though too that I think I'm not sure who is in the webinar right now or what outlets folks are coming from here, but I think if you're taking away anything from what you're hearing here is that covering Indigenous affairs and especially extractive industries in Indigenous affairs requires a lot of work and a lot of focus. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the Native American Journalists Association, about to be the Indigenous Journalists Association, has really pushed very hard to say that newsrooms need to have Indigenous reporters or Indigenous affairs beats who can focus on this as an area of expertise, because this isn't something you can just casually jump into or casually plug into, or just maybe you saw something on Twitter and you go after a grant so you can go down and check it out. Like, if you want to do real and impactful reporting, you need to have a lot of time invested into the topics that you're covering. It's not something you could just do a special project on. All of these loopholes and all the ways in which we think about these as reporters, and how we're thinking about when it comes to exposing wrongdoing. It's not easy to do when you just jump into it. It's something that you really, really need to be dedicating time to, and really pushing your newsroom to start thinking very critically about hiring Indigenous reporters and building Indigenous affairs beats in order to be able to do this kind of coverage, because it's some of the most important coverage on the planet right now. And there's there are nowhere near enough people who are doing it.
Also like to add that one of actually a lot of journalists lives are also at risk when they start exposing these issues. No, just recently here in the Philippines, a radio commentator was killed simply because he was exposing what is wrong, what is happening that's wrong. No, so here in the Philippines, at least, in some parts of uh, I don't know if it's unique, but also in India, when the journalists make reports on this, then their lives are at stake, there are a threat. And in some cases, several journalists already have been killed. So I think that's the other thing that we have to think about, how do we protect these journalists who are exposing what is wrong and who are putting their lives at risk as well.
Two things. I always say that a very very basic thing, but it's still important because most journalists don't do. Uh, do your homework. Do a proper research. Dig deep about the subject of your pitch, your story, because like has been said here, mining extractive industries in general is not a easy sector to cover. You really have a long curve of knowledge to tell a proper story. And also, like Victoria said, these double standards are very important because the way a big mining company from Canada, which is the financial center of mining in the world, the way he in some cases act in Canada is not the same way they act in the global south, for example. So it's very important to understand this difference, who of course has a lot to do with history, colonialism, racism, and etc. And show this in the story.
Great, thank you, Mauricio. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question here. So, we've talked a bit about some violence here. Indigenous people increasingly face violence, imprisonment, or threats when resisting extractive industries on or near their territories. A Mongabay article looked at violence and conflict in 9 Latin American countries and found that 363 indigenous leaders were killed between 2012 and 2020. Most of this violence occurred while leaders were trying to defend their territory from extractive industries. So the question is, how can journalists keep indigenous sources and communities safe when reporting on contentious or controversial projects?
I mean, I think it's knowing the security infrastructure of the country that you're reporting in and understanding what what threats people do face. So again, doing your homework, as was just mentioned, is really knowing the environment that you're walking into. But apart from that, I mean, digital security is a huge thing that everybody really needs to be thinking a lot more about. I'm still really surprised that like journalism programs in schools, for instance, are not teaching their students how to deal with digital security, which is oftentimes the ways in which sources or people are sort of caught by security services and security forces. So there are a number of ways you can sort of deal with this, and in terms of beefing up how you're interacting with people, understanding the environment that's there. But and again, I think you mentioned the reporting around the number of land and human rights defenders that have been killed over the years. I mean, we're hundreds of people who are being killed or murdered for for standing up for their rights and defending their communities. And again, there just aren't enough people who are covering this, or newsrooms who are covering this. I mean, I think some newsrooms invest more financing into covering the Kardashians than they do indigenous communities around the world. That's it's a huge travesty to the kind of work that we can be doing, and frankly, I think it's an insult to what journalism can be. And the fact that violence is a real factor that people need to be thinking about really speaks to that.
Thank you, Tristan.
Well, I mean, most of these murders happened here in Latin America in the past years, and mostly involved the mining industries and agribusiness, like Global Witness report show every year. And the truth is very hard to keep the community safe, the journalists self safe, because that's depends of the environment of the country, the public policies, the general condition for the report. Of course, you can make an interview off the record if the your source are threatening by someone in some places, but overall we need to make an advocacy effort to push governments to improve the situation, like here in Brazil in the Amazon, the Bruno Pereira and Don Phillips murder. This happened a few months ago in the Amazon. It became a worldwide case. So, I mean, it's a big problem right now in the here in Brazil Amazon, for example, and I know, of course, in other countries as well. You can took some measures to undermine the threats, but overall that depends of the conditions of the society and what kind of policies the government are implementing in your country right now.
Thank you, Maurizio.
Yeah, that's why we are also using more and more some of the existing mechanisms. For instance, in the UN now, the several countries are undergoing the Universal Periodic Review. The Philippines, I think, Ecuador, and Colombia, they are subjected to this, and that's when we mobilize our own colleagues, our own forces, to go there and present the reports of all these kinds of violence that are happening in indigenous territories. We also meet with other diplomats because, when you are in that arena, you cannot raise the questions. The governments, only the member states are the ones allowed to raise the question. So we prepare by meeting with some diplomats from other countries for them to raise the questions or the comments that we would like to be made more visible in that kind of meeting. So there's really no shortcut, no, in addressing these kinds of violence, because it's always a conflict of who is more powerful, who has the more resources, who has who has the bigger interest at stake. While indigenous peoples, of course, have the biggest interest at stake, they don't necessarily have the political nor economic power to that will equal what these extractive industries have. So that kind of inequality really is what makes the situation even worse. And of course, it's very easy for them to also corrupt the government officials, no, to bribe them, and to also even use the courts, no, against indigenous people. So all these kinds of things that are happening in a country level, I think that the role of journalists is so important, because we can see that if when these are exposed, at least in the mainstream media, and of course even in social media, then there are campaigns that come about to make the issue even stronger, and to make the perpetrators more accountable. At the end of the day, it's really the human rights approach that should be promoted very strongly, and to ensure that the obligations of the states to their human rights commitments are really being followed.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. So this one has to deal with uncontacted peoples. So how are uncontacted people particularly vulnerable to extractive industries, and what concerns should journalists look out for when extractive projects are proposed on their territories?
Well, the indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation are indeed the most vulnerable, no, because they are not their immunity system is not used, no, to the kinds of diseases or problems but that outsiders do, I have when they come into communities. Also the kinds of even if they are not the mining is not done in their communities, it is in nearby communities, they are also affected. I did a country visit in Brazil, and I met with the Yanomami, and they showed me a report about mercury poisoning, no, among themselves, of the young children. And this is the result, of course, of the garimpiero mining operations, no. So the vulnerability of uncontacted peoples is really the threat of them being subjected to genocide. They can really disappear. There are very few of them, and they are very vulnerable. And any kind of operation that brings in these kinds of contaminants, as well as people who have such diseases that indigenous peoples are not immune to, can really kill a lot of indigenous people. So that's really the problem that we face. The other thing, I have been to the Amazon as well, and now increasingly I was flying over and I saw uh, smoke coming out from a particular, it's a forested community. And then I learned that these were the Waurani who were with me were saying that these were Chinese companies, no. And I think that's the other issue. There are a lot of Chinese companies all over the world now. In Ecuador, I was there as well, and that's the situation. So there really needs to be a exposés about these threats that indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation face, and measures be taken by the government. There are supposed to be measures. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has defined very clearly the measures that the governments need to take to protect these peoples. But again, implementation is always the problem.
Thank you, Victoria.
I mean, excellent. I'd just like to add, like here in Brazil, we have a strong background, a long record of genocide with uncontacted people, not only in the first centuries of European invasion here, but in the past decades and nowadays. They're happening right now, like Victoria says, in the Yanomami territory, which is the size of Switzerland. So, and they have thousands and thousands of illegal workers, garimpeiros, inside their land, who are treating the community, who are raping indigenous women and girls. So, and even, like I said before, the mining in indigenous land is not allowed here in Brazil, but we have this illegal mining widespread in the country. And if they change the laws in the Congress, for example, they have one law right now waiting for the approval. We also have thousands of requests for industrial mining inside indigenous land, including several ones with people in voluntary isolation. So it's a huge problem. Like many indigenous leaders say, we are in the verge of a new genocide here in Brazil.
Thank you, Maurizio.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said here. I mean, I think the only thing that I would add is for folks that are looking to cover this topic, and especially with people living in voluntary isolation, again, I think you really need to be careful about what you're thinking about and how you're going about these stories. Generally, I would say the framing that I see around uncontacted tribes or people is one of exoticism. And oftentimes, when extractive industries are thrown into that mix, there seems to be sort of a sense of a foregone conclusion that this is sort of the end for people. And I think that is a very pervasive sort of reporting tactic, at least in English-speaking outlets and American outlets, is this idea of we know these people will disappear, and we're just sort of writing one of the we're just writing one of the obituaries for them. It's quite insulting, degrading, and I would say also aids bad actors that are involved in these violent activities by sort of giving them cover that this was going to happen anyway. So I would really caution newsrooms to think critically about the work that they're doing around this, and think very critically around their framing and the ways in which they're thinking about the communities they're reporting on.
Great. Thank you so much, Tristan. Does anyone have anything to add? We've got just a couple more minutes here. And so I'm going to go ahead and just see if anyone here has any, resources that journalists can access or go to for information that you think everyone should be aware of.
The Native American Journalists Association has some really great resources for reporting in indigenous communities. Everything from, looking for indigenous sources all the way up to, tribal nations media guides. There are a lot of different and great resources that are there, including the ever popular bingo card. It's the bingo that you don't want to get, which includes all the cliches that tend to show up in indigenous stories. It's a really great guide to use, and if you use it on your story and you get bingo, you probably don't want to do that story. So some of them are playful, some of them are more serious, but it's a great place to go and get started if you're really thinking about getting into indigenous affairs reporting.
Thank you.
The other resources that I think should be used by journalists are, of course, the reports of special rapporteurs. No, when my predecessor James Anaya made a special report on mining and indigenous peoples, whenever I do country visits, for instance, when I did a visit to Ecuador, even to Brazil, I also mentioned some of the issues related to extractive industries and how indigenous peoples are affected. There is a special rapporteur on mercenaries, no, private mercenaries used as security by companies, and of course, some of the reports will show that mining companies are the ones who are also getting these mercenaries, or they the other way that the mining companies provide, use their own security, is they use policemen. No, after they are off duty, this policeman or army men are used by the companies. So these are some resources that can be used. And I mentioned earlier some of the reports of these established institutions like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. I was reading some of the reports that they made, and they will make a report of like for a country about what were the revenues earned by the company, etc. And sometimes I think journalists should look into these reports and validate whether it's true, because they will claim that they have this number of millions or even billions of dollars that they have contributed to the country's economy, etc. And sometimes many of these, while those may be true, the other side of the story is not seen. No, in terms of what does that cost, what is the cost of that to the environment and the indigenous peoples from which they are extracting these resources. So I think there are several reports out there that once in a while the journalists can visit, because it can really show them some information that sometimes is not made known publicly. So of course, they don't necessarily have press conferences, these kinds of bodies, because that's not to their interest. No, but we should really dig into these kinds of reports and analyze whether what they are saying is true, or what is it that they are not saying.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. Mauricio, do you have any resources to add?
Yeah, here in Brazil, we have a lot of different resources from public data available of course, the indigenous organizations if you're looking for sources and etc. But I'd just like to quote three important databases and reports here. The first one is the Complicity in Destruction from Amazon Watch, complicityndestruction.org, OAG. You're going to find a lot of good reports about who is financing the destruction of indigenous lands in the Amazon, about, for example, the blood gold, which is extracted in indigenous land in Brazil and is fueling the supply chain of almost all the big techs in the world. Plus, forests and finance have a very large and good database about these investors in mining and in other sectors as well. And the Pulitzer Center and Earthside just launched a special project, and when you can see online the scars of garimpo over the Amazon, and of course you can see the satellite images and cross this with other kind of data and sources and etc. And that's the tree I can quote here right now.
Great, thank you so much.
One more thing, Mike. Yes, one of the things that I think should be looked more into as well are really the kinds of treaty agreements between the countries, between the states and the investors. No, in many of these agreements, usually these agreements are sort of how do you call, they have clauses that will say that the state cannot sue them, you know, when and they cannot expropriate these kinds of industries, you know. So there are many parts of those agreements that are really detrimental, no, to the interests of indigenous people. So maybe it's good also to expose those so that indigenous peoples will have more knowledge about what these agreements contain and do the things that they necessarily need to do.
Thank you, Victoria. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to move on now. That's it for our main panel. We're going to go ahead and answer the audience Q&As. So we want to make sure that everyone can get out of here on time. So we're going to limit the session to roughly around 15 to 20 minutes, but we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So let's go ahead and examine and see what has come in on the comments. Just 1 second here. This is a comment from Sergio. I just want to put it up here so you guys can examine it here. I'm not sure exactly which question that was referring to, but if anyone has anything to elaborate on this, feel free to go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, I can say something about this. Indeed, it's not just environmental consultants that they hire, but also anthropologists. No, in the case of the Philippines, for instance, some anthropologists are being hired, and even in Latin America, I've seen this, who will say that either there are no indigenous peoples in that particular territory where mining is happening, or they will say, you know, they will come up with some conclusions which will provide more justification for the mining companies or extractive industries to proceed, you know, even if there is a law against mining, for instance. So I think that's one of the things that they do. The other thing, of course, are environmental consultants, because we also demand, there is also this strong demand for doing human rights due diligence or environmental impact assessments, no. And in some cases, the environmental impact assessments that they do are not really you know, very scientific, in the sense that they will identify exactly what are the possible environmental impacts. In fact, they sometimes weaken those potential impacts. Only when the accidents happen will you suddenly see that some of the reports of these environmental consultants have been manipulated. So of course, I'm not saying that all of them are bad. There are the ones who are really good, of whom we in fact use, no, really very you know, environmental consultants or anthropologists with integrity, and they are not willing to be used to suit the interests of the extractive industries.
Great, thank you. Maurizio or Tristan, did you have anything to add to that comment?
I just like to add, Victoria said very well, but here it happens a lot. For example, one environmental impact study made by a consultancy for a mining company just overlooked the existence of the indigenous communities. They say basically that there are no indigenous communities who are going to be impacted by the project. They are basically lying in the report. So it's the case, for example, of Belosan, a Canadian company who
Yeah.
are trying to implement a big gold mine project in the Amazon, and
Mm.
these legal disputes are going on for more than one
Yeah,
decade
exactly.
right
Yeah.
now. And
Yeah.
this is just one example, and this happens all the time. They make a very long and good with hundreds of pages, and say, oh, there's no indigenous community here, no one's going to be impacted, everything's fine. So of course you have to be very critical about this kind of report. Like I said before, the mining company has a lot of money to pay
Exactly.
for
Yeah.
the report they want.
Exactly.
Thank you, Mauricio. Tristan, did you have anything to add?
No, I think everybody said it pretty well.
No worries. Got a comment here from Caroline. I'm just going to go ahead and throw this one up. She says, thank you for this. Love the work you're doing. Institute for Small Islands and She Changes Climate. So thank you, Caroline.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
So while we wait for a couple of questions to come in, did anyone have anything that they wanted to elaborate on earlier that they didn't get to speak about, or maybe something that they thought about in the discussion that we just had?
Well, one of the things that I always think about is really the the many incidents of which in which free prior informed consent is manipulated, and which is manipulated to allow, to permit, to allow these mining companies to operate. Usually, indigenous peoples don't have much recourse, no, because of course the state will say, the consent has been obtained, even if it was obtained in the wrong way. So I think that there really needs to be some kind of system wherein indigenous peoples can bring, their complaints regarding how free prior informed consent has been obtained, the kinds of bribes or manipulations that have been made, the divisions that are created within the communities, because at the end of the day, this is what allows the companies to continue doing the wrong things that they are doing, no? And so that's one issue that I feel is something that has to be, the mechanism should be used much more, the existing mechanisms, but also if, for instance, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues can can somehow set up that kind of system. And then just going back to to the consultants, there should also be, some of the environmental consultants or anthropologists or sociologists who really have who usually have their own associations. They should speak out also when these environmental consultants are being used by the companies and are coming up with false reports. Because if the academic community is used in such a way, then the kind of academic freedom that has to be promoted is really undermined significantly, and people lose trust, no, in these kinds of academics, and and that's why also indigenous peoples have to have their own uh, uh, kinds of experts in these issues, so that they can be used much more by them, because they are more trusted than others. I know that there are other indigenous persons also have been used and allowed themselves to be used, so those kinds of things should as well be exposed.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Does anyone else have anything to add before we close it down?
I mean, I just add that really, again, if you're thinking about doing any sort of Indigenous affairs reporting, you need to have an Indigenous editor or you have to have an Indigenous writer, but you have to have an Indigenous person involved in the process. It's the same principles in terms of being able to gain trust in the communities you're reporting in and gaining trust with your audience. And that comes with bringing on the right people to do this kind of work. It's complicated, it's time consuming, and it really requires almost a completely additional set of reporting skills that your newsroom might not already have. Also requires a different perspective to be able to do these stories. Again, we talked earlier about audience and the reasons that you do what you do. These are important and complex stories that can make really big changes in the world. They can also alienate your audience very, very quickly. They can also provide cover for people who are doing bad things. So, I think that the topic has to be approached with a lot of thought, a lot of care, and with a lot of intention. If you're going to proceed down this route, one of the quickest and best ways to do that is to bring on Indigenous people to help you with that reporting.
Well said, Tristan. Thank you so much. All right, folks. Well, that's about all the time we have for it. And I just want to, give a big thank you to our panelists here for providing such an informative discussion, and always to our audience for participating in these webinars, which we hope are, continuing to inform the work that you're doing. We really do appreciate you being here. So if you RSVP'd to this event, you should be receiving an email with a quick survey after we're done here. So please do fill that out and let us know what you think so that we can keep improving our webinars. Once again, this will be published to our YouTube channel as soon as we're done, and timestamps and resources will be added at a later date. And then we'll be publishing a link to this on our blog at mongabay.org as well. Again, if you have any ideas that you want to pitch to us or to other outlets, you can do so. If you have any ideas that you want to pitch to Mongabay, that is, you can do so at our opportunities page at mongabay.org. Scroll down and click on either Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities and Conservation, or Land Rights and Extractive Industries, whichever one of those applies to your story idea. While you're there, you can also sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which shares new paid reporting opportunities and job openings at Mongabay. And please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us for future discussions, including our final webinar of this year, which will be on illegal wildlife trafficking. You can get updates about that one via our accounts on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, where we're going to post announcements and updates in advance of each. And if you haven't already checked out our podcast, the Mongabay Newscast, occasionally we have some announcements there as well. So I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar, and thank you for making it a success. And we will see you all at the next one.